I really like Valve games. Valve has been dominant over the gaming world for decades at this point, and for good reason, because Valve revolutionised the industry in ways that few other companies could possibly dream of. But in the last few years, Valve's dominance has been slipping, and their fans are increasingly more frustrated with their actions in the recent past. And if you ask Valve fans why they think the company has gone in the direction that it's gone in, they'll likely all give you the same answer. Valve is a very strange company. Internally, they work much different from other companies, and their inner workings have caused a myriad of issues for both the company and the consumer for a very long time. In past videos, my explanation has gone something like this. Valve very infamously allows their employees to basically do anything they want. Instead of assigning employees to certain departments or projects like most companies, Valve instead lets its employees choose what to do and when to do it. Just so long as they're doing something. As long as every single game and service that they have gets enough attention to actually function, the higher-ups at Valve let the devs go and work on whatever project they feel like. So put yourself in the shoes of a Valve employee. You can work on Htwo, a 15-year-old game that's had countless updates in its history. Or, you can revolutionise virtual reality technology in the office across the hall. Which do you think the highly qualified programmers and artists at Valve would rather do? This is sort of true, but for the sake of a shorter video, this explanation is highly oversimplified. Because the reality is, this is Valve's open explanation to how their company works internally. This is what they tell you. This is what is released in their employee handbook that they intentionally made public in 2012. Valve is flat land. Valve lets you steer the company in any direction you choose. But the reality of this is a lot more confusing. Because although that there's no formal hierarchy, and no one individual tells everybody else what to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that nobody dictates what gets done at Valve. Because as it turns out, removing a formal hierarchy in a workplace doesn't actually remove all of the hierarchy. It just replaces a formal one with a social one. Certain individuals have more clout within the company than others, based on past and current successes within their workplace. These certain individuals can never officially tell anyone what to do, but they can have a huge sway on what happens within the company. Not to mention that this lack of hierarchy only goes up to a point. The company still has a CEO, and a very famous one at that. And if Gabe Newell takes a significant interest in the projects that you happen to be working on, he can make massive changes to your project and what happens within it whenever he feels like it. Decisions that, from an employee standpoint, completely come out of nowhere, and drastically affect what this employee does with their time at work on a day-to-day basis. Now, the management structure that every other company has would make being told what to do a prerequisite for working there. That's how basically every company on Earth works. But at Valve, you're told that you can do whatever you want, all the way up until suddenly you can't, because someone with more social clout, or someone with actual power at the company, decided that what you're doing should change somehow. If Valve doesn't like you or the project you're working on, Valve has yearly peer review meetings where the people with all the clout inside the company can get your pay lowered, your project moved, or even get you fired. And even if this doesn't happen, if your project is starved of new hires, it will die a painful death anyway. And this can be dictated very easily by the people with all that power in the company. Not necessarily people with formal managerial roles, but people with social clout. Valve attracts some of the best talent in the entire world, with their huge brand, their hefty paychecks, and their insane employee benefits. But internally, their company is losing talented workers in droves. People find the environment far too stressful. So stressful, in fact, that they will give up all of the benefits that come with working at Valve just to escape it. Valve is a very strange beast, and their flatland philosophy on management is still in use at the company to this day. But it really doesn't tell the whole story, because Valve allows people to work on whatever they want, all the way up until they don't. As you can imagine, this sort of information about the internal workings of a company can be hard to come by, so just for the sake of clarity, I will leave some of the sources that I've used in the description below. Valve has a very, how do you say it, idiosyncratic way of managing their company. So you might be wondering, how the hell does Valve manage to do this? How does Valve manage to afford to allow their employees to work like this? How does Valve go without releasing any game or product for years at a time without going bust? Well, it's simple, really. Steam has a monopoly on PC gaming, and it has done for decades. And after everything we talked about in the last section, there is no doubt in my mind that Valve would have gone bankrupt years ago without Steam. There are some newcomers in the space that are taking off a little bit, but if you ask me, they have way too many issues to realistically compete with what Valve has got going on over here. Steam takes a huge cut of sales revenue from games that they sell on their platform. Between 20 to 30% of all money made from sales goes directly to Valve. And the list of games on Steam is absolutely enormous. Steam makes more money than Valve could ever dream of making from the games that they actually produce themselves. Which is why, for the most part, they don't really make games anymore. Like seriously, they made Dota 2 in 2013, then released nothing but a VR tech demo for 5 years, then they released Artifact in 2018. Don't worry, we're gonna get to you later. And then they released Half-Life Alyx, a game that the overwhelming majority of Half-Life fans can't play even if they wanted to, because they can't afford a VR headset. This makes absolutely no sense from a business standpoint. Valve knows for a fact that the first new installment in the Half-Life series since 2007 being exclusively VR won't make them as much money as if it was just a normal FPS game. But they don't care. They would rather revolutionize VR technology than make all of those billions of dollars. But they don't need to care, because Steam takes care of the billions of dollars already. In fact, Valve makes so much money from Steam that they're currently fighting an antitrust lawsuit over the monopoly that Steam has over the market. The lawsuit claims that Valve uses their huge monopoly to manipulate and exploit publishers and consumers. Valve's extremely high cut of sales profits forces publishers to raise prices. It also forces developers to spend less money on development. And most importantly, the publisher's price rises force the consumer to pay more for their games. Now, I'm no expert on any of this, so I don't want to necessarily say if this sounds true to me or not. But quite frankly, a company exploiting a monopoly that they have over an industry wouldn't really be new to anyone. And Valve has had an unbroken monopoly over PC gaming for decades. To a lot of PC players, if your game isn't on Steam, it doesn't exist. So Valve's huge profits come almost exclusively from Steam. Valve makes games, like, sometimes, but mostly it just uses Steam as an enormous cash cow, while also simultaneously profiting off of pre-existing games with in-game, highly popular microtransactions and trading economies. Games like TF2, for example. TF2 makes a sickening amount of money for Valve, despite how old it is and despite the lack of development in the last 5 years. And speaking of Team Fortress 2, I talked extensively about Team Fortress 2 in a recent video, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much. If you want to hear my extended opinion on the state of TF2, then you know where to find it. But TF2 is arguably Valve's most successful multiplayer game to date. Successful in the sense that it still has huge player numbers after 15 years of existence. Most games companies would kill to have a game be half as popular for half as long as Team Fortress 2 has been. But as we've discussed, Valve is really fucking stupid. For anyone out of the loop, Team Fortress 2 has had a bot problem for a few years now. The lack of development on the game is causing TF2 to become infested with cheating bots in casual mode. Bots that make the game basically unplayable. If you're a new player and you want to play this highly popular, completely free game on Steam, you will likely run into a dozen cheaters or more instantly. And these cheaters spam lots of super offensive things in the in-game chat and in-game voice. And all of this is caused by one simple issue: the lack of development attention from Valve. Now, all of this is old news, and I've talked about it a million times, but I'm talking about it again because the TF2 community has been on a little bit of a crusade recently. The consensus amongst the TF2 community is that the only way to make Valve take action in TF2 is to create a PR disaster for them that they just can't ignore. And recently, IGN posted this article. TF2 players are protesting over the game's massive bot problem. People have spammed hundreds of messages to dozens of media sites trying to create a storm over how Valve's neglect is allowing bots to make their most successful game completely unplayable, and how these bots also spam extraordinarily hateful things in the game's chat to make it as hostile of an environment as they possibly can. The hope is that Valve has a huge PR disaster over all of the articles that get released, and maybe this causes a ton of problems for Valve. Maybe their stock prices go down, who knows? And maybe this PR disaster causes Valve to, actually do something to support one of their most profitable games and make casual mode actually playable for the first time in 2.5 years. And who knows, maybe this is the case, and maybe this will work. But unfortunately, I don't personally have too much hope in this working. TF2's botting problem has lasted a very long time and is already a bit of a PR disaster for Valve, and they still don't care. I don't know how much bigger of a story it would have to become for Valve to actually do something about it. It's a good attempt for sure, and I hope it works, but I really don't have that much faith. Valve's crazy internal structure causes old projects to be seen as lesser, despite the profits that they might rake in. And this means that the game doesn't see development. No matter how unplayable the game becomes, it will not see development. So all I can hope for is that community servers are still alive and kicking for the foreseeable future so that I can keep playing my favorite— Wait. Did you see that? Whoa, wait, rewind. This server is VAC secured. Cheating will result in a permanent ban. Valve, psst, hey over here, guys, quick, hey Gaben, look, quick over here. Your anti-cheat system doesn't fucking work, it doesn't work. VAC stands for Valve Anti-Cheat, and as you can see from Exhibit A and Exhibit B, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Here's a simplified version of how Valve's anti-cheat actually functions. The VAC system scans your device for digital signatures inside your computer's memory. Every program in the background of your computer will be scanned for this little signature that it has, and Valve allegedly has an ever-changing database of new cheating software to add to this database. If your device is scanned and found to have cheating software on it while you're in a VAC-secure server, VAC will wait between a few hours and a few days and then ban your account. The logic behind waiting a few days to ban the player is that if they don't ban them instantly, the player might not know which cheating software got them detected and banned in the first place. Now, in theory, all of this sounds good, and maybe back in 2007 it all worked fine, but it is a deeply flawed system in very many ways. But if you've played TF2 or CSGO in the last few years, you really don't need me to tell you that. Valve's anti-cheat system does get cheaters banned, don't get me wrong, but as a permanent solution to all cheating in all Valve games, it just isn't effective. Just like with every other anti-cheat system out there, cheat makers are constantly in an arms race against software like VAC to make their cheats as hard to detect as possible. Sure, VAC might catch up eventually, but if a cheat maker has created a cheating software that's extremely difficult to detect even just for a month or two, that cheat software can ruin thousands upon thousands of games. Now, this is true with basically every anti-cheat software out there, but more modern anti-cheats seem to be much harder to circumvent than VAC currently is. The likelihood of meeting a cheater in Valorant is very low because their anti-cheat is very effective. The anti-cheat is also very invasive, which is definitely a turn-off, but it's significantly more effective than VAC. But the biggest issue with VAC, especially at the moment, is that VAC is powerless against bots. Remember that part earlier about leaving it a little while before banning cheaters? Well, this means that bots are functionally immune to Valve's anti-cheat. Bot makers can make hundreds of accounts at a time, and since the game is free to play, the bot accounts can just join games for a few hours or a few days right up until they're banned. And after they're banned, the creator just makes a few hundred more. And VAC is powerless to do anything about it. Don't get me wrong, VAC does ban cheaters, but it's certainly not the most effective solution. At least not anymore. I mean, look at this bastard that I encountered a few days ago. And this guy is in a community server. Nowhere's safe anymore. But at least VAC gives us some funny clips.
He's out in the Russian wilderness just sniping. Did Emilio just get VAC banned? What? What?
Now let's quickly talk about this guy for a sec. This is Gabe Newell. He is the CEO of Valve, and he is one of, if not the most famous CEO in all of the video game industry. And when he talks, people listen. But Gabe hasn't been a developer at Valve for a very long time, and if insider information is to be believed, he also doesn't really make too many executive decisions over development anymore either. He runs the business side of things. He makes major decisions pertaining to the business side of the company, not the development side of the company. But he is still a figurehead. He's still the famous frontman that everyone wants to listen to. So unsurprisingly, Gabe is the guy that gets sent out to do interviews and public talks about the company and what they're working on. And Gabe sort of just says stuff.
Is Valve planning any major updates for Team Fortress 2?
There
Yes, we have updates we keep purchasing.
Okay, because are you aware of the ongoing bot or hacker crisis?
Oh yeah, we're very aware of the problem and I think we have good solutions for it.
Just because he can. In fact, the perfect example of Gabe's constant promise-making is also the most famous example.
After Orange Box, we have to get episode 3 out. We know how the trilogy ends, and there are a bunch of loose ends and narrative arcs that need to come to a conclusion in episode 3. The main thing that we're working on right now after we get the Orange Box out the door is going to be episode 3. Welcome to Half-Life 2, episode 2. We are at the midpoint in our trilogy of episodes, which will conclude in episode 3.
Can you tell us anything about when we'll see episode 3?
I'm not saying anything about episode 3 or the other things that we haven't talked about.
Are you still even working on Half-Life 2 episode 3? When can we micro-invest in it through Steam so it will actually come out?
I really don't have anything to say about episode 3 right now. When we do, we'll certainly let people know, but I don't have anything that I'm going to say.
Are you still doing episode 3? Because I think when people
Yes,
look
of course
at now
we're
the
doing
history
episode
of it,
3.
it's like,
Gabe is a figurehead, and apparently he says these sort of things on purpose for a couple of reasons. Reason 1, he makes an announcement to intentionally create hype to try and push certain devs on certain projects to do work that he wants them to do. Reason 2, he doesn't want the people interviewing him to react negatively, so he just says whatever they want to hear to avoid a PR backlash. This is likely the explanation for the TF2 clip. Reason 3, Valve is working with a certain third-party team that he wants to please with a certain announcement at a certain time. Gabe Newell has said many things in the past that haven't come true, and he will continue to do it in the future. But quite frankly, it's not even really his fault, is it? Because of the inner workings of Valve as a company, all of these big blunders are very likely not at all his fault, but the fault of teams that one way or another ended up not pushing projects forward or getting projects cancelled. Gabe being the figurehead that he is means that the things he says are mostly coming from a lovable personality that the gaming industry respects. The things he says are not necessarily realistic or honest, even if he wishes they were. But for as long as Valve is a weird-ass company internally, they will continue to have Gabe saying all sorts of random shit that doesn't end up coming true. Now, I told you I'd get to it later, didn't I? Artifact is Valve's biggest failure of a game release. In fact, it's actually Valve's only failure of a game release. Valve had never once released a game that was this unpopular. Seeing the success of other industry giants in the card game industry made Valve want a taste, and they got some of the best minds in the business on the board. On the board, I didn't even realise that when I wrote. People like Richard Garfield, who invented Magic the Gathering, the most popular competitive trading card game ever. This guy thoroughly understands what makes a card game tick, and he was leading the development of this game. But unfortunately, Artifact was announced and released to a community that just didn't ask for it. The majority of Dota players just didn't care that there was a card game incoming from Valve. The only people that were interested were people who were already coming from card game communities like Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. And you might think that this is a good thing, but in reality this popularity amongst card game nerds was actually a bad thing. Not because card game nerds killed the game or anything, but because the popularity amongst them was indicative of what the game was going to be like on release. On release, Artifact's biggest problem wasn't a lack of interest. Its day one player numbers were nothing to scoff at. Its problem was its complexity. Artifact had targeted the most hardcore of TCG fans, making it extremely complex and skill expressive. But this complexity ended up dramatically alienating the casual audience. You know, the casual players? The people that make up the overwhelming majority of basically every single game ever made? They didn't want to play this card game. The turbo nerds who already loved card games were loving it, but they were alone in their enjoyment. Artifact was extremely sophisticated, but part of the success of games like Magic and Hearthstone was that it had complexity, but it was easy to understand on a surface level. It had a low skill floor with a high skill ceiling, but Artifact's skill floor was high. It was very high, and only the most dedicated card game players even cared to get past this barrier to entry. And this wasn't the only issue. Artifact's in-game economy was extremely expensive, with very few free ways to earn anything. But it also had a price tag to play the game to begin with, unlike the free-to-play model of games like Hearthstone. The game also had to compete with Magic the Gathering Arena, which launched in the same year as Artifact, but was a much less botched launch and was already a game that had a huge following. So Artifact was basically dead on arrival. The game died very quickly and very quietly, and didn't really ever pick up steam again. And amidst all the mess, Richard Garfield was laid off by Valve after the launch. Valve basically said nothing about Artifact for an entire year, until they announced that they were going back to square one to remake the entire game. And they did do this. They released Artifact Foundry in 2021. Had you ever heard of Artifact Foundry until I just mentioned it? Because I hadn't either until I started researching the video. So that probably tells you all you need to know about how this game did on release. That was my attempt at talking about the biggest issues that Valve has as a company. If there's anything you think I missed, please do tell me down below because I would love to hear it. Now, I really love Valve's games. They've almost never made a bad game. Almost. But with what Valve has become in recent years, I fear that Valve will never be the games company that made all these classic games ever again. And if I can just pray for one thing and one thing only, with all of my heart, all I ask is that Half-Life 3 isn't VR exclusive. Thanks for watching.